So if we go back to the fall of 1924, there's this incredible scene where a group of California ranchers basically pool all their money together.
Right, just local guys.
Yeah, exactly. Local farmers, shopkeepers, some bankers even. And they go out and buy a massive stockpile of industrial dynamite.
Which is just, I mean, that's quite a visual.
It really is. And they take this dynamite, march out to this heavily guarded concrete aqueduct, and they intentionally blow up the water supply of the city of Los Angeles.
Yeah, they just blew it to pieces.
And the thing you have to understand is, these weren't anarchists. They weren't criminals.
Yeah, they were citizens.
Right. They were just regular people whose entire town was systematically and completely legally being erased from the map by this giant metropolis that was located over 200 miles away.
It's wild to think about because, we usually look at modern infrastructure as this massive triumph of engineering, right?
Oh, totally. Like clean, logical decisions that somehow let millions of people live in a desert.
Exactly. But the truth is, the water coming out of your kitchen tap today has, it has a ghost story attached to it.
It absolutely does.
It's a history that's defined just as much by what was destroyed as by what was actually built.
Yeah.
When you turn on a faucet, anywhere in the modern American West, you're plugging into this massive plumbing system that was forged during this very specific, really intense window of time.
Through a series of just staggering dispossessions.
Staggering dispossessions, yeah, and massive environmental crises.
And so that is our mission for this deep dive. We're opening up a really comprehensive historical dossier on those foundational years of California's water wars.
Roughly spanning from 1884 to the 1920s, right?
Exactly. And for everyone listening, we're going to be looking at some heavy primary documents today. Things like the 1913 Raker Act, the 1884 federal court ruling in Woodruff v. North Bloomfield.
It was a huge one.
It really is. We've also got federal air quality data from the Great Basin Unified Air Pollution Control District and a bunch of synthesized historical records.
But before we get into, the actual mechanics of how you move a river, we probably need to lay down a quick ground rule for how we're doing this analysis.
Good call. Let's set the table.
So we have to avoid the temptation to just sort of cartoon these historical figures into neat little categories of absolute heroes and absolute villains.
Right, because history is never engineered that cleanly.
Exactly. It's messy. So we are going to objectively examine these concepts. We'll look at the idea of water theft right alongside the defense of lawful purchase.
Because those are fiercely contested viewpoints in the sources.
Highly contested. And we're going to impartially look at all the motivations of the era, the legal frameworks they had to work with, and, the physical reality of these environments that were just irrevocably altered.
Right. And to really understand how the law eventually allowed cities to just swallow entire distant watersheds, we actually have to start by looking at an industry that tried to swallow a mountain, literally.
Yeah.
And the legal wall that they eventually ran into. Because if you look back at the gold rush, the image we all have from 1849 is, a guy standing in a stream with a tin pan.
The classic 49er.
Right. But that surface gold tapped out incredibly fast. By about 1853, near Nevada City, the mining industry realized they had a problem. They had to scale up.
Yeah, they had to move from just panning rivers to basically attacking the landscape itself.
Because the gold was trapped, right?
Yeah, the gold they wanted was locked deep inside these ancient, super compacted gravel beds. They were essentially fossilized river channels located high up in the Sierra Nevada foothills.
Wow. So panning is out of the question.
Completely. Digging it out by hand just wasn't economically viable anymore, especially for the massive corporate syndicates that had sort of taken over the industry by that point.
So what did they do?
Well, they weaponized water. They developed hydraulic mining.
And we are not talking about a gentle, targeted wash here. The technology escalated with terrifying speed.
Oh, it was industrial scale almost immediately.
They engineered these high-pressure water cannons. They call them monitors.
Right, monitors.
And the early ones, I think they used canvas hoses, but they very quickly evolved into these massive articulated iron nozzles.
You really have to picture it like a piece of heavy artillery just bolted directly to the bedrock.
But instead of firing an artillery shell, it's firing this highly concentrated, incredibly pressurized stream of water directly into a hillside.
The physics of these monitors are just staggering. I mean, even by modern industrial standards.
Give me a sense of the scale here.
Well, by the 1870s, some of the largest operations were using a specific device known as the Craig monitor. What they would do is capture water high up in the mountains, route it through dozens of miles of wooden flumes and iron pipes.
Boy, dozens of miles.
Dozens of miles, yeah. And they'd drop it hundreds of feet in elevation to build up immense hydrostatic head pressure.
Because of gravity.
Exactly. So by the time that water actually reached the nozzle, it was exiting at pressures exceeding 4,000 pounds per square inch. Yeah. It's unimaginable pressure.
So, I mean, if you were to step in front of that stream, it wouldn't just knock you over, it would cut you in half.
It would kill a person instantly, without question. But obviously they weren't aimed at people, they were aimed at geology.
Right.
The miners blasted these high-velocity streams into the gold-bearing hillsides, intentionally undercutting the banks until massive cliffs of earth, hundreds of feet high, would just collapse.
They were literally dissolving the mountain into liquid slurry.
Yes, a slurry of mud, gravel, cobbles, and hopefully gold. And then that was all washed through these massive bedrock sluice boxes.
And that's where they use mercury. Right.
Yeah, they use mercury to amalgamate and catch the fine gold flakes as the mud rushed by.
You know, the phrase moving mountains is always used as a metaphor, but here it is the literal business model.
It really was. They turned the foothills into an alien moonscape.
But my immediate thought looking at this process is, well, matter cannot be created or destroyed. Right? If you dissolve an entire mountain range into liquid mud, it doesn't just magically vanish after you extract the gold. Where does all that material actually go?
Well, it just followed gravity. It washed directly into the local watersheds.
Oh.
We are talking about the Yuba, the Bear, and the Feather rivers. And the sheer volume of this debris is almost impossible to overstate.
How much are we talking about?
Geologists estimate that over 1 billion cubic yards of sediment were flushed out of the Sierra Nevada.
1 billion cubic yards.
Yeah. To put that in perspective for you, that is roughly 8 times the amount of earth that was moved to excavate the entire Panama Canal.
That is insane. 8 Panama Canals worth of mud.
And all of it was pushed directly into the river systems that drain straight into the Sacramento Valley.
And this is where the major collision happens. Because downstream in the Sacramento Valley, you have a completely different economy taking root.
Right, things were changing fast.
It's the 1870s now. And the valley is rapidly transforming into this really vital agricultural hub. Farmers are planting orchards, they're growing wheat, establishing permanent towns.
Yep, building a life.
Exactly. And suddenly the rivers they rely on are just choking on this massive industrial byproduct.
Yeah, it created a phenomenon known as aggradation.
Explain that a bit.
Well, the rivers were naturally graded by thousands of years of flow, right? They simply did not have the kinetic energy to carry millions of tons of heavy mining debris all the way to the ocean.
The water just wasn't moving fast enough to carry rocks?
Precisely. So the heavier rocks and gravel settled first up in the foothills, and then the finer sands and that really thick mud settled further downstream in the valley channels.
Right where all the farms are.
Exactly. And as the sediment piled up, it physically raised the riverbeds.
Which is wild. Looking at the historical maps of Marysville and Yuba City from that time, it's a terrifying layout. The debris accumulated so heavily that the bed of the Yuba River was actually raised above the level of the surrounding town.
Yeah, the river was essentially flowing on a ridge made out of its own waste.
That sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
It was. The towns desperately tried to build levees to keep the water out, but they were trapped in a losing arms race against the sediment. It just kept coming.
And it ruined the local economy, too.
Oh, completely. It destroyed steamboat navigation, which was vital for agricultural transport back then. But more importantly, it weaponized the winter rains.
How so?
Well, when the normal seasonal floods arrived, the raised, choked-up rivers had zero capacity to hold the extra water.
Ah, right. Which leads directly to the Marysville flood of 1875.
Yes, a devastating event.
The levees breached, but it wasn't just water that came pouring through the town. It was what they called slickens.
Slickens, yeah.
It's this incredibly fine, super dense, nutrient-dead mud created by the pulverization of quartz during the mining process.
It's basically liquid concrete.
Exactly. It buried orchards, completely ruined the topsoil, and devastated the local farming economy. It's like if you pressure washed the toxic lead paint off your house, right? But you engineered your gutters to funnel all that sludge directly into your neighbor's living room.
That's a great way to picture it.
And when the neighbor complains, you just shrug and say, well, I'm generating economic value.
And the crazy part is, that was the exact legal and moral defense of the mining syndicates.
Really? Just deal with it.
Pretty much. Their argument was deeply rooted in the raw, extractive ethos of the early West. They basically argued that gold mining was the foundational economic engine of California.
Which, to be fair, it had been.
Right. And they pointed out that their investments in these flumes and monitors were massive. So their stance was that the damage downstream was just an unfortunate but totally unavoidable cost of progress.
So they felt they had the right to just ruin the river.
Yeah, they essentially claimed a prescriptive right to use the rivers as industrial sewers simply because they had been doing it since the gold rush began.
But the neighbors, the agricultural community, they fought back. They didn't just accept it.
No, they organized.
The farmers of the Sacramento Valley formed something called the Anti-Debris Association. They pooled their resources, hired incredibly sharp lawyers, and actually filed a massive lawsuit against the North Bloomfield Gravel Mining Company.
Which was one of the absolute largest hydraulic operations out there.
Right. And this whole fight culminates on January 7, 1884, in a federal courtroom in San Francisco, with Judge Lorenzo Sawyer issuing his decision in Woodruff v. North Bloomfield.
And Judge Sawyer's ruling is, it is one of the most consequential documents in Western environmental and legal history.
It really set the stage for everything.
It did. He presided over a massive trial, and he actually personally traveled to the mining sites to witness these monitors in action.
He went out there himself.
He did, and he toured the devastated downstream farms, too. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. His final decision was this 225-page opinion that just systematically dismantled every single one of the mining company's arguments.
I want to look really closely at the exact legal mechanism he used here because, and correct me if I'm wrong, he didn't technically make hydraulic mining illegal, did he? Like, he didn't ban the monitors themselves.
That is a critical distinction, and it's what set the whole template for environmental law. Sawyer did not rule that extracting gold via water pressure was inherently illegal.
Okay.
What he ruled was that dumping the resulting debris into the watershed constituted a, quote, public and private nuisance. So he issued a perpetual injunction barring the mining companies from discharging their tailings into the Yuba and Sacramento River systems.
Which is just a brilliant legal maneuver. Because if you tell an industry, look, you can keep operating, but you absolutely cannot dispose of your billion cubic yards of waste in the river, you've effectively shut them down.
Without ever having to debate their fundamental right to mine.
Because there was physically nowhere else for the slurry to go?
Exactly. The decision really hinged on this fundamental tension in early water law. The farmers relied heavily on the English common law doctrine of riparian rights.
Which means what, exactly?
It essentially states that if you own land along a waterway, you have the right to receive that water undiminished in quantity and quality.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the miners, conversely, relied on the doctrine of prior appropriation, which is basically first in time, first in right.
Right, the whole we were here first argument.
Exactly. They argued they were there first and therefore had priority to use the river for whatever they needed. But Sawyer's ruling found that no amount of prior appropriation gives a private entity the right to destroy the property of others downstream.
So here's my question. Why did the courts have the backbone to say no to these powerful, incredibly wealthy gold miners in 1884? But later, as we'll see, they completely caved when urban developers wanted to destroy landscapes. What made the miners so vulnerable to this specific ruling?
It really comes down to the legal perception of the actor's purpose.
What do you mean?
Well, the hydraulic mining syndicates were private for-profit corporations, right?
Right.
Their sole operational mandate was to extract wealth to enrich private shareholders. So when that private profit motive came into direct, undeniable physical conflict with the property rights of downstream farmers who were, building permanent communities and producing food, the court could clearly identify a villain.
I see.
The miners completely lacked the moral and legal shield of the public good. They were just getting rich while literally burying their neighbors in mud.
Wow. So the Woodruff decision fundamentally redefines the concept of water in the West. It forces this massive transition. Water can no longer be treated as a tool of raw, unrestricted extraction.
Exactly. You can't just do whatever you want at the headwaters, regardless of who it kills at the mouth.
It becomes a resource bound by shared consequence. You have to actually consider the downstream impact, at least when the damage is this glaringly obvious and caused by a private corporation.
Right. It established that a watershed is an interconnected system. The legal system recognized, really for the first time on a massive scale, an environmental limit to industrial capitalism in the West.
It was a staggering victory for the agricultural communities,
Huge.
which, sounds incredibly optimistic. It feels like the legal system learned its lesson in 1884 and figured out exactly how to protect nature from unrestricted extraction.
It does sound nice, doesn't it?
It really does. But that optimism falls apart almost immediately when we move to our second story. Because Woodruff proved the law could stop environmental destruction when it was driven by private, corporate profit. But what happens when the entity causing the destruction isn't a gold syndicate, but a thirsty, rapidly expanding city?
A city claiming they are acting for a public purpose?
Right. The rules of engagement flip entirely. So to see how a city weaponized the very legal structures meant to protect resources, we have to advance our timeline to the turn of the century and shift our focus down to Southern California, specifically Los Angeles.
Yeah, this is where the story gets really complicated.
If you look at a topographical map from 1902, Los Angeles shouldn't really exist at the scale it does today. Geographically, it is a trap.
Total trap. It's a semi-arid basin, completely hemmed in by mountains on one side and the ocean on the other.
And the population was just exploding at this time. It was transitioning from this quiet pueblo to a major agricultural and commercial center. But they were entirely reliant on the Los Angeles River and local groundwater.
And they were bumping up against a hard, uncompromising ecological ceiling.
Yeah, there's only so much water.
Exactly. The civic leaders, the real estate developers, the engineers, they all realized the same mathematical certainty. The local water supply was maxed out.
If they experienced a prolonged drought, or honestly just simply continued growing at that rate, the city would wither.
Survival meant finding water outside their own watershed.
And this desperate search outward introduces us to two of the most consequential architects of the modern West, Fred Eaton and William Mulholland. These are the men who figured out how to break the city out of its geographic cage.
Yeah. Fred Eaton is really the visionary of this story, though. I mean, visionary here carries a heavy, complicated weight.
For sure.
He was a former mayor of Los Angeles and a former city engineer. He had a really deep understanding of water systems, but honestly, more importantly, he understood power and real estate.
A dangerous combination.
Very. Eaton was the one who looked 230 miles north across the brutal expanse of the Mojave Desert and identified the salvation of Los Angeles.
The Owens Valley.
The Owens Valley.
And we should clarify, the Owens Valley at this time wasn't some barren wasteland just waiting to be claimed. It was a thriving, established agricultural community.
It really was.
It sits at the eastern base of the Sierra Nevada mountains, fed by the Owens River, which is just gorged on pure, massive volumes of snowmelt. Farmers and ranchers had spent decades building irrigation canals, planting orchards, and basically creating a green ribbon of prosperity in a very dry part of the state.
Yeah, it was a completely self-sustaining regional economy. But Eaton didn't see a community, he saw a reservoir. And his partner in this whole endeavor was William Mulholland.
Tell us about Mulholland.
So Mulholland was an Irish immigrant and a brilliant, entirely self-taught engineer.
Which is crazy to think about, self-taught.
It is. He had started out literally digging ditches for the original private water company in LA, clearing out the Zanja Madre, or Mother Ditch, and he had worked his way up through sheer competence to become the superintendent of the newly formed, publicly owned Los Angeles Department of Water and Power.
Okay, so if Eaton is the guy looking at the map and scheming, Mulholland is the guy figuring out how to bend the physics of the earth to actually make it happen.
Exactly. Mulholland is tasked with building the pipe.
But before you can build a 233-mile aqueduct, you have to actually own the water. You can't just send an army into the Owens Valley and take it by force.
Right, you need the deeds.
They needed to acquire the land, and crucially, the riparian water rights attached to that land.
And this is where the history enters deeply murky, just fiercely debated ethical territory. Between 1902 and 1905, Fred Eaton began traveling up to the Owens Valley to buy property. But he didn't announce he was scouting for Los Angeles.
Of course not.
He engaged in a highly coordinated, incredibly covert acquisition strategy. Eaton presented himself as just a wealthy rancher, buying up options on key parcels of land, particularly the ones that controlled crucial diversions on the river.
So he intentionally concealed his true motive, which was to sever the water from the land and export it entirely out of the basin.
Yes.
Yeah.
He is playing a massive game of chess, but he's lied to all the other players about what game they're even playing.
And it gets exponentially worse when you look at how Eaton gathered his intelligence.
Yeah.
Because he had someone on the inside.
He did.
Let's dig into the role of Joseph Lippincott.
Oh, Lippincott. He represents the absolute collapse of ethical boundaries in this narrative.
Sarah?
Lippincott was a highly respected engineer working for the U.S. Reclamation Service. And we have to understand the context here. Congress had just passed the Federal Reclamation Act in 1902, specifically to help local farmers in the arid West build irrigation projects.
Right, to help the locals.
Exactly. And the federal government was actively surveying the Owens Valley to build a local reservoir that would have permanently secured the water for the Owens Valley farmers.
Okay, so Lippincott's literal federally mandated job is to help the Owens Valley community protect and manage their water.
That is exactly the opposite of what he actually did.
Unbelievable.
While he was drawing a federal salary to assist the valley, Lippincott was simultaneously and very quietly receiving payments from Fred Eaton for quote-unquote consulting work.
Oh my God, a side hustle sabotaging your own federal project.
Basically, yeah. Lippincott gave Eaton unprecedented access to the internal federal surveys, stream flow data, and land ownership records. He essentially handed Eaton the blueprints to the valley's vulnerabilities.
But he didn't just leak documents, right? Didn't he actively derail the federal help?
He did. Lippincott used his position within the Reclamation Service to slow walk the local irrigation plans.
Just delaying everything.
Yeah. And eventually, he formally recommended that the federal government abandon the Owens Valley project entirely, arguing it just wasn't feasible.
Which is a lie.
Complete lie. But this deliberate bureaucratic sabotage cleared the field completely, allowing Los Angeles to swoop in and purchase the water rights without having to compete with a federally backed local project.
If you're a farmer in Owens Valley, relying on the federal government to help you build local infrastructure, and that very government agent takes a secret paycheck to sell you out to a distant city, I mean, how can anyone frame that as anything other than deeply unethical trickery?
It's hard to defend, for sure.
Right, because there's a historical argument in the sources that says, well, you know, the farmers got paid for their land, it was savvy business. But looking at the Lippincott connection, that defense feels completely hollow.
And this is the exact center of the whole theft versus purchase debate. Proponents of the city's actions point straight to the ledgers. Los Angeles paid cash for those deeds.
True.
The transactions were legally executed under the laws of the time, so they argue that Eaton was just an aggressive buyer securing a vital resource for a growing metropolis.
But the context of leverage destroys the idea of a fair market. If a buyer lies about their intentions, uses a compromised federal agent to sabotage your alternative options, and then buys up the key parcels, that isn't a free market. It's an ambush.
The leverage was hydraulic just as much as it was financial.
What do you mean by hydraulic leverage?
Well, water tables are connected, right? If Eaton buys the 3 biggest ranches in a sector and allows Los Angeles to cap the canals and prepare for diversion, the water table beneath the neighboring farms begins to drop.
Oh, wow. So even if you don't sell, you're losing your water.
Exactly. The local agricultural economy just fractures. The general store loses customers. The bank struggles. Suddenly, a farmer who swore he would never sell looks at a dying orchard and realizes he has no choice.
He is selling under severe duress that was engineered by the city.
Yes. Eaton dismantles an entire regional economy piece by piece through forced attrition.
That is brutal. But what about Mulholland in all this? Is he just the innocent engineer following orders, or does he share the moral culpability here?
Mulholland's legacy is incredibly complex. I mean, he was not the man out in the valley lying to ranchers. That was Eaton's domain entirely.
Right.
But Mulholland was fully aware of the strategy. He was the instrument of the city's reach. Did he prioritize engineering progress over the ethical treatment of a distant community? Unquestionably.
He had to have known what was happening.
Of course. But to understand Mulholland, you really have to understand the utilitarian ethos of his era. He did not view himself as a thief, not at all. He viewed himself as a public servant executing the highest moral calling of his profession.
He's basically doing the math, right? I can save hundreds of thousands of lives in Los Angeles by sacrificing a few thousand in the Owens Valley.
Precisely. And this is where the legal shield of civic ambition becomes so incredibly powerful. Going back to the Woodruff case, remember the hydraulic miners were shut down because they were operating for private profit.
Right.
But Los Angeles arrived in the Owens Valley, waving the flag of the public good. They argued that water used to sustain a booming modern metropolis was a fundamentally higher and better use than water used to grow alfalfa in a remote valley.
And the legal system just bought that.
The legal and political systems of the era bent entirely to accommodate that utilitarian calculus.
It's acceptable to destroy a community as long as the community you were building with its bones is larger.
That was the logic, yeah.
Wow. And once they secured the deeds, they had to actually build the thing, which the physical reality of moving a river across the Mojave Desert is staggering.
Oh, the construction of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which was executed between 1907 and 1913, it remains one of the most audacious engineering feats in human history.
It's unbelievable.
Mulholland commanded an army of over 2,000 laborers, operating in brutal, remote desert conditions where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees.
The backbreaking work.
Completely. They had to lay 233 miles of conduit. They dug massive open canals lined with concrete and bored 164 separate tunnels through solid mountain ranges, including the 5-mile-long Elizabeth Tunnel.
And the most mind-bending part of this entire system is the power source. They didn't rely on massive diesel pumping stations to push the water over the mountains.
No, they relied almost entirely on gravity.
Which is wild.
Mulholland surveyed a route that utilized the natural elevation drop from the Owens Valley all the way down to the Los Angeles basin, so the water flowed on its own accord.
But gravity also created massive engineering hurdles, right? Specifically when they had to cross deep canyons.
Yeah, that was a huge problem. To solve this, they utilized something called inverted siphons.
Okay, you have to explain how an inverted siphon works, because to me that feels like a magic trick to get water to flow uphill.
It does seem like magic, but it relies on basic hydrostatic pressure. When the aqueduct reached a massive depression, like the Jawbone Canyon, they obviously couldn't build a trestle bridge high enough to carry an open canal all the way across.
Steep.
Right. So they built a massive steel pipe that went down the steep canyon wall, across the canyon floor, and back up the other side.
Like a giant U-shape.
Exactly. Because the entry point on the north side was slightly higher in elevation than the exit point on the south side. The weight of the water pushing down forced the water back up the opposing wall.
But the pressure at the bottom of that U-shape must be immense.
It was terrifying. At the bottom of the Jawbone siphon, the water pressure exceeded hundreds of pounds per square inch.
How did the pipe not just explode?
The steel plates required for the bottom sections were over an inch thick, and they had to be manufactured in Pennsylvania, shipped all the way around the Horn of Africa, hauled across the desert by specialized 52 mule teams, and then riveted together on site by hand.
The sheer logistical violence of it is awe-inspiring.
It really is.
And it all culminates on November 5, 1913, at the Newhall Spillway, also known as the Cascades, located just north of Los Angeles.
Yeah, it was a defining moment in the history of the city. Over 30,000 residents, which was a massive portion of the city's population at the time, traveled by train, buggy, and early automobile just to gather around the spillway.
They wait for their lifeline to arrive.
Exactly, and William Mulholland stood before the crowd.
Now, he had just completed a monumental, career-defining project. You'd expect a grand, sprawling political speech, right?
You would.
But he gives one of the shortest, most chillingly pragmatic addresses on record. As the gates opened and the water from the Owens River came crashing down the spillway into the San Fernando Valley, he turned to the crowd and said exactly 5 words.
There it is, take it.
There it is, take it.
It perfectly distills the ethos of extraction, doesn't it? The water is no longer a natural system. It is a captured prize. It is an object delivered for consumption.
Yeah. When he says, there it is, take it, it's framed as this divine, life-giving gift to the city. But knowing what we know about how it was acquired, it feels much more like a forced amputation.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Los Angeles gets the lifeblood it desperately needs to grow into a global city, but the Owens Valley gets the phantom limb pain.
And that pain manifested in a very rapid physical collapse. Through the late 1910s and into the 1920s, Los Angeles just exploded in population.
They needed more water than the initial diversion provided.
Way more, so they began buying up more ranches, deepening their diversions, and ruthlessly pumping the groundwater.
And the farms that were left?
The farms in the Owens Valley that had tried to hold on just began to fail outright. The pastures turned to dust, the orchards withered and died.
And the people living there didn't just sit back and watch their town die. Which brings us back to that massive stockpile of dynamite I mentioned at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Yes. As the economic strangulation tightened, the resentment boiled over into open physical resistance. The Valley residents engaged in a literal agrarian revolt against the city's infrastructure.
When did this start?
It started on May 21st, 1924, when a group of ranchers dynamited the Alabama Gates, which was a critical control structure on the aqueduct.
They blew up the city's plumbing.
And they escalated from there. By November of 1924, hundreds of Valley residents, including women and children, marched on the Alabama gates and physically occupied the infrastructure.
Wow.
They seized the controls, opened the emergency spillways, and diverted the entire flow of the Los Angeles Aqueduct back into its natural channel in the Owens River.
That is a massive act of civil disobedience.
They held the gates for days. It was all aimed at forcing Los Angeles to the negotiating table.
And Los Angeles responded by sending heavily armed posses and police with machine guns to guard the pipe. It was literally a shooting war waiting to happen.
The tension was astronomical.
The bombing campaign really peaked in 1927. They were repeatedly blowing up sections of the massive steel siphons, trying to make the maintenance costs too politically toxic for LA to handle.
Right.
But what fascinates me is how this resistance actually ends. It wasn't ended by a massive gunfight with the LAPD, it was ended by accountants.
Yeah, the collapse of the Owens Valley resistance is a brutal lesson in modern power dynamics. The leaders of the rebellion were Wilfred and Mark Watterson.
Who were they?
They were brothers, and they owned the prominent banks in the Owens Valley. They were essentially the financial architecture of the community.
Right.
They provided the loans that kept the struggling ranchers afloat, and they held the savings that allowed the community to hire lawyers and, presumably buy dynamite.
So they are the economic engine of the fight.
But in the summer of 1927, just as the sabotage campaign was reaching its absolute height, state bank examiners unexpectedly arrived in the valley.
Oh, no.
They audited the Wattersons' books and discovered a massive, catastrophic shortfall. The Wattersons had been cooking the books.
Wait, how exactly? Were they stealing money to fund the bombings?
The exact motivations are a bit tangled in the records. As the agricultural economy collapsed due to the water diversions, ranchers obviously couldn't pay their mortgages.
Right.
To prevent the banks from failing and to keep the resistance funded, the Wattersons had been illegally transferring funds from depositors' accounts to cover bad loans and margin calls.
Oh, wow.
When the state auditors uncovered the embezzlement, they immediately shut the banks down. The Watterson brothers were arrested, tried, and sentenced to San Quentin.
But the ripple effect of that audit is just devastating for the town.
It wiped out the life savings of virtually every family in the valley in a single afternoon.
Just gone.
Gone. The financial backbone of the community snapped. You cannot hire a lawyer in Los Angeles, you cannot buy dynamite, and you cannot sustain a political movement when every penny you own vanishes into thin air.
The organized resistance evaporated immediately.
Almost overnight.
It sets a really profound, cynical precedent for the 20th century, doesn't it? Water wars aren't ultimately won in trenches with dynamite. They're won in ledgers and boardrooms.
Financial power proved infinitely stronger than physical sabotage.
But the story doesn't end with the banks failing. The environmental bill for this extraction came due, and it was horrifying. We have to talk about the subtractive damage inflicted on Owens Lake.
Yes. Owens Lake was a massive, shallow, terminal saline lake at the very end of the Owens River.
What was it like before the aqueduct?
It was a vibrant ecosystem, incredibly alkaline, sure, but teeming with brine shrimp and serving as a crucial stopover for millions of migratory waterfowl.
But then LA took the water.
Because Los Angeles was diverting virtually the entire inflow of the river into the aqueduct, the lake was cut off from its source.
It's like if you stop filling a bathtub in the desert, the sun eventually evaporates whatever's left.
Exactly. By 1926, Owens Lake had essentially vanished. But it didn't just leave behind a sandy beach. The lake bed was composed of thousands of years of accumulated fine silt and minerals.
Right.
When the water evaporated, it left behind a massive efflorescent salt crust. As the fierce winds funneled down the eastern slope of the Sierras, they shattered this crust, lofting millions of tons of microscopic alkali dust into the atmosphere.
Going back to my phantom limb analogy from earlier, the phantom limb here is literally a toxic dust bowl.
And we are speaking about scientifically measurable toxicity here. The exposed bed of Owens Lake became the single largest source of PM10 particulate pollution in the United States.
PM10. Explain what that means.
PM10 refers to particulate matter that is 10 micrometers or smaller in diameter.
Why is that specific size so dangerous to us?
Because it is small enough to completely bypass the human body's natural filtration systems. When you breathe in dust that fine, it doesn't just get caught in your throat or your nose.
Where does it go?
It penetrates deep into the alveolar regions of the lungs and can even enter the bloodstream. It causes severe respiratory issues, exacerbates asthma, and causes long-term cardiovascular damage.
That's terrifying.
To give you some context from the Great Basin Unified Air Pollution Control District data, the EPA standard for safe PM10 exposure is 150 micrograms per cubic meter over a 24-hour period.
Okay, 150 is a safe limit.
Right. During severe wind events at Owens Lake, monitors were recording PM10 levels exceeding tens of thousands of micrograms per cubic meter.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah.
It was essentially a localized chemical weapon.
Yes. And the people breathing it were the residents of the Owens Valley who had already lost their water and their life savings.
Los Angeles had successfully solved its water crisis, but in doing so, they had engineered an environmental and public health catastrophe 200 miles away.
And they fought taking responsibility for it for decades.
Did they ever fix it?
It wasn't until the late 1990s, under immense legal pressure from the Air District and the EPA, that Los Angeles was finally forced to begin mitigating the dust. They have since spent over $2 billion engineering shallow flooding and planting vegetation on the lake bed just to hold the toxic soil down.
I want to explicitly contrast this with the hydraulic mining we examined in 1884.
That's a really important comparison.
Because the miners caused additive damage, right? They added 1 billion cubic yards of debris to the rivers, and it was highly visible. The courts could easily point to the mud bearing a farm and say, stop.
Exactly.
But in the 1920s, Los Angeles caused subtractive damage. They removed a resource. The absence of the water is what caused the toxic dust storms.
And legally, subtractive damage is far more difficult to prosecute. When a city uses lawful contracts to purchase water rights and diverts a river, and a lake miles away slowly dries up into a toxic hazard.
It's harder to point the finger.
Right. The causality is scientifically clear, but the legal liability was practically impossible to enforce at the time, especially because Los Angeles was operating under the powerful doctrine of public purpose.
They weren't a greedy corporation. They were a municipality securing life-giving water for their citizens.
Exactly. It is an incredibly heavy moral balance. On one side of the scale, you have the undeniable reality that the Los Angeles Aqueduct allowed millions of people to build lives, industries, and a global cultural hub.
And on the other side of the scale, you have deception, economic ruin, and a poisoned ecosystem.
It is the defining tension of Western infrastructure. You cannot separate Mulholland's staggering engineering triumph from the toxic dust blowing off Owens Lake. The achievement and the dispossession are the exact same physical act.
That is just, it's heavy. And this tension over what a city is allowed to destroy in the name of survival wasn't just happening in Southern California.
No, it was happening up north, too.
Right. In the exact same year that water first flowed down the LA Aqueduct, 1913, another major California city was making its own permanent, devastating mark on a distant landscape.
Yes, Los Angeles proved you could legally drain a valley if you claimed public purpose.
But San Francisco took that exact same legal shield and tested it against the highest possible barrier, a federally protected national park.
Right. We are turning to the story of Hetch Hetchy.
And to understand the ferocity of San Francisco's motivations here, we have to recognize the trauma the city had just endured.
The earthquake.
Yes. In April 1906, San Francisco was nearly erased from existence by a massive earthquake, followed by fires that raged uncontrollably for days.
And a major reason the city burned to the ground was because their local water system, which was owned by a private monopoly called the Spring Valley Water Company, utterly failed.
The soil liquefied, the poorly maintained mains shattered, and the fire department basically stood there with dry hoses while the city turned to ash.
The psychological impact of that failure cannot be overstated.
I can't even imagine.
In the aftermath of 1906, the civic leaders of San Francisco resolved that they would never again be held hostage by a private water monopoly, and they would never again lack the water needed to protect their citizens.
So they demanded a massive, publicly owned, entirely reliable water and hydroelectric power supply.
And just like Los Angeles, they looked to the deep snowpacks of the Sierra Nevada. Their engineers zeroed in on the Tuolumne River.
Specifically, they targeted a glacier-carved gorge known as the Hetch Hetchy Valley.
Aesthetically and geologically, Hetch Hetchy was spectacular. It featured massive granite cliffs and cascading waterfalls. Admirers actually called it the twin of Yosemite Valley.
It was that beautiful.
It really was. But its physical geography, a deep, steep-sided canyon with a narrow granite bottleneck at the end, and a pristine river flowing right through the center.
It's the absolute mathematically perfect location to build a dam and create a massive reservoir.
Precisely. But there was a massive legal roadblock. Hetch Hetchy wasn't a patchwork of private ranches like the Owens Valley. It was located entirely within the boundaries of Yosemite National Park.
Ah, it was federal land.
Yes, theoretically preserved in perpetuity for all the people of the United States.
So San Francisco couldn't just deploy a Fred Eaton to quietly buy up land deeds. To build a dam inside a national park, they needed explicit authorization from the federal government.
They would have to go to Washington, D.C. and literally lobby Congress to pass a law allowing them to flood a piece of America's natural heritage.
And this ignites one of the most vicious, culturally significant environmental battles in American history. On one side, you have the city of San Francisco, led by their chief engineer, Michael O'Shaughnessy, arguing for municipal survival.
And on the other side, you have a man whose very name is synonymous with the wilderness, John Muir.
John Muir. He was an iconic naturalist, a prolific writer, and the founder of the Sierra Club.
He had spent his life exploring the Sierras. And for Muir, Hetch Hetchy wasn't a resource to be mathematically evaluated. It was sacred ground.
He viewed the valley as a spiritual sanctuary.
He did. And he fought the dam proposal with everything he had, writing furious articles, organizing massive letter-writing campaigns.
The rhetoric he used was deeply religious, wasn't it? He famously wrote, "Damn Hetch Hetchy," as well, "Damn for water tanks, the people's cathedrals and churches, for no holier temple has ever been consecrated by the heart of man."
Yeah, he framed the battle as a stark moral choice between the spiritual preservation of the natural world and the crass, destructive commercialism of urbanization.
But let me push back on Muir's idealism for a second here.
I've played devil's advocate.
Put yourself in the shoes of a San Francisco city planner in 1910. Your city just burned down. Thousands of people died. Hundreds of thousands were left homeless because of inadequate infrastructure.
True.
From the perspective of lawmakers, securing a clean, safe, reliable water supply to prevent typhoid outbreaks and fight fires absolutely has to outweigh the scenic beauty of a valley, even a stunning one. Wasn't Muir being a bit of an elitist, arguing that a pretty view for a few wealthy hikers was more important than the basic survival of hundreds of thousands of urban residents?
That was precisely the counter-argument mounted by San Francisco, and they actually found a really powerful ally in Gifford Pinchot, who was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Pinchot championed a philosophy of utilitarian conservation. He argued that natural resources should be managed scientifically to provide the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run.
So he sided with the city.
He did. Pinchot testified before Congress that providing clean drinking water to a major city was undeniably a higher and more noble use of the Tuolumne River than leaving the valley untouched for a minority of recreationists.
It is the ultimate test of the public purpose shield,
Mm.
and it worked. The political lobbying by San Francisco was relentless, and it culminated in the passage of the Raker Act.
Right. The Raker Act was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson on December 19, 1913.
1913, that same year.
Yep. The act granted San Francisco the right-of-way to construct the O'Shaughnessy Dam and flood the Hetch Hetchy Valley. It contained strict stipulations like the city had to generate public power and was forbidden from selling the water or electricity to private corporations, but the core reality remained.
They were authorized to drown a national park.
Exactly.
Let's pull back and contrast this 1913 Raker Act decision with the 1884 Woodruff decision. In 1884, a federal judge steps in to protect a river from being destroyed by industry. 30 years later, the federal government eagerly passes a law authorizing the permanent destruction of a pristine valley inside a national park.
The difference entirely revolves around the identity of the actor.
The hydraulic miners were private syndicates committing a public nuisance for private wealth. The government felt totally comfortable shutting that down.
But San Francisco was a public municipality seeking water for the health and safety of its citizens. The government viewed the municipal virtue of providing public utility as a far higher priority than strict environmental preservation.
They legalized the destruction because the beneficiary was the public, not a corporation.
Exactly. And John Muir lost the fight. The timeline of his defeat is incredibly poignant.
When did he die?
The Raker Act was signed in December 1913. Almost exactly 1 year later, on December 24th, 1914, Muir died in Los Angeles.
Wow. I know there is a very persistent, emotionally resonant myth in environmental circles that Muir died of a broken heart over the loss of his mountain temple.
Right, you hear that a lot. But medically speaking, he was 76 years old and died of pneumonia.
But the psychological toll of the defeat was undeniably immense.
Oh, absolutely. He had poured the final years of his life into saving Hetch Hetchy, and he failed completely. Construction began, and by 1923, the O'Shaughnessy Dam was completed. The reservoir slowly filled, burying the valley floor under hundreds of feet of water.
But the historical afterlife of the Hetch Hetchy fight is arguably much larger than the dam itself, right? Even though Muir lost the physical valley, the battle fundamentally transformed the environmental movement.
It really did. Before Hetch Hetchy, preservationism in America was largely an aesthetic and philosophical pursuit. Muir's early writings were about transcendentalism, poetry, and inspiring people to appreciate the beauty of the wilderness.
But the brutal political reality of the Hetch Hetchy fight taught the nascent Sierra Club a very hard lesson.
They realized that writing beautiful essays about pine trees wasn't going to stop a federally funded concrete pour.
Exactly. They learned that they were up against highly organized, well-funded urban lobbying machines operating on utilitarian principles.
So Hetch Hetchy forced the environmental movement to evolve into a hardened, pragmatic political lobbying force. It became the founding parable of modern American conservation.
It galvanized citizens across the country who realized that if a valley inside Yosemite National Park wasn't legally safe from industrial development, absolutely nowhere was safe.
The loss of Hetch Hetchy is really what gave the modern environmental movement its political teeth.
And the ghost of that valley still haunts California politics today. We are sitting here over a century later, and there is still an active, highly debated movement demanding that the O'Shaughnessy Dam be dismantled, the reservoir drained, and the Hetch Hetchy Valley restored.
It remains a genuinely open debate. Technologically speaking, San Francisco now has alternative, albeit highly expensive and complex, methods for storing and managing that water downstream.
So the question forces us to continually weigh our entrenched modern infrastructure against our evolving environmental values. Are we willing to incur massive municipal costs to resurrect a flooded cathedral of nature?
It's a huge question.
So let's synthesize what we've uncovered in this dossier today. We've examined 3 foundational templates forged in California between 1884 and the 1920s that really dictated how water would be weaponized and legislated.
Right, first we saw the legal limit.
The Woodruff decision that established shared consequence and ended the massive environmental violence of private hydraulic mining.
Then we saw the rural dispossession.
The Owens Valley drained and its economy fractured through covert leverage to feed the explosive growth of Los Angeles.
And finally, we saw the drowned temple.
Hetch Hetchy sacrificed by the federal government so San Francisco could achieve municipal security.
These events are not isolated historical anecdotes. They are the architectural blueprints for the entire modern West.
They established the legal precedents for who gets water, how it can be moved, and the staggering environmental and human costs that society is willing to legally tolerate in the name of progress.
And if you are listening to this, you have a direct physical connection to this history. The water flowing from your tap, the winter produce that ends up on your plate, and even the air quality warnings triggered by dust blowing off a dry lake bed on a windy day.
These are the direct physical afterlives of paper transactions and court rulings made a century ago by men like Sawyer, Eaton, Mulholland, and Muir. History isn't just something trapped in a book. It is the physical infrastructure you rely on every day.
The environment you inhabit is a legally constructed reality.
Which brings me to a final, slightly provocative thought I want to leave you with, looking back at our first story. We universally celebrate the 1884 Woodruff decision for stopping the massive environmental violence of hydraulic mining.
As we should.
But diving into the historical records, there's evidence that it didn't completely end the practice. It just forced it underground. It pushed it to smaller, quieter operations that built hidden dams in remote canyons, dumping debris where it's harder for the courts to see.
Right.
It makes you wonder, did California's early legal system actually learn how to protect nature? Or did it just teach the architects of extraction how to make their damage less visible? Did Fred Eaton in Los Angeles look at the miners' failure and realize that the key to taking what you want isn't raw force, but hiding your destruction behind the unassailable legal shield of public purpose?
That is the essential question. If a legal system only punishes the violence it can easily trace, the incentive for developers isn't to stop the damage. The incentive is simply to become better at hiding the causality, or better at justifying the sacrifice.
Think about that the next time you turn on the faucet. The water flows instantly, clear and cold. But what is hidden behind that glass? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the archives. Keep questioning the hidden history behind the everyday infrastructure around you. We'll catch you next time.